So, tonight's discussion will be about, obviously, how to conduct ground-up warfare in RP and Ancerious, and how to have it sort of make sense. First off, we're going to be looking at why conduct ground warfare in RP. Secondly, how to RP ground warfare in a sensible fashion. Then what not to do in the ground warfare RP, and how to avoid derailments, orbital bombardment. How to operate ground forces effectively, how to conduct ground battles with sort of nomadic or very superior technology or unconventional nations, how to use orbital defences and ground assets effectively, and what resources will be helpful to doing these types of RPs. So the first sort of topic is obviously going to be why conduct ground warfare RP. Well, the number one reason, and brace yourselves to this, is it's actually pretty cool. I know, shocking, but at the end of the day, people enjoy ground warfare. They think it's cool. They want to see armies going head to head. They want to see tanks engaging each other. They want to see big mechs and titans fighting, and they want to have their big, great cinematic battles. Not everything has to be in space just because it's sci-fi. So at the end of the day, most of the time, when you have any sort of ground battles, the reasoning is you want to do it because it's good fun. However, that said, there are plenty of reasons as to why you would actually wish to conduct ground warfare in character. First off being securing a particularly advantageous solar system. So, for example, a good example of that in Ancerious history would be Adelshaven, or Tal Valoris, the fact that it is the premier site for Ancerium refining, and the fact that it lays in the middle of the Adelshaven corridor into the Golden Expanse. That got taken over by rebels, and, you know, the big super nations had to turn up and try and get them out, but you can't just turn up and orbital bombard the planet, because that's the economy right there. So you have to actually send troops to go and retake it. So taking an advantageous solar system, taking a position which has resources and infrastructure, which also falls under that sort of example as well. If you're taking an enemy planet, you could blow it up. Yeah, cool. You could orbitally bombard it into the ground, but then you could also capture the infrastructure intact, which means you then don't have to spend 20 years building cities and infrastructure and mining equipment and particle accelerators and all the like, because there's, no point to turning up somewhere to capture it if you're just going to destroy all of the useful stuff there. Another reason might be that their enemy is conducting some sort of research on the planet or on an asteroid base or whatever, and you want to go down there and you want to capture it. I mean, you're not going to turn up to a place to sort of find out on enemy research and immediately orbitally bombard it. That's going to be silly. If they're already building that weapon, you want details of it, and you want it now. So that would be a good example of, sending in a special operations force or a small army for hit and run. But, yeah, at the end of the day, there's loads of different reasons why you would conduct ground RP and do warfare on planetary surfaces. But when I say ground RP, that doesn't always mean fighting on planets. That could be fighting on airless moons. It could be fighting on megastructures. It could be fighting on huge space stations. It could even be fighting inside some factions' ships, given the size of things. So it really is quite a wide subject. But the main reason is it's cool and people enjoy it. So, does anyone have any questions of sort of when and where to conduct ground RP? I guess not. Okay, so we'll move on to the next point: how to sort of make it work in a sensible fashion. Well, first off, you've got to think about what the context is, because I can't just tell you a be-all and end-all for all situations. If you're on the defensive in a planetary invasion, then obviously you're going to have pretty much what's available to that planet / solar system, and you're going to have that at your disposal, which is going to be PDF forces, maybe some militia forces, standing army units, orbital defences, maybe aerospace forces. You name it, it's going to be available to you. In this fashion, the best way to sort of have this make sense would be you don't just muster all of your sort of defensive armies out in the open and man all the defences and go like, right boys, let's fight those bastards when they get into orbit, because if the enemy turn up and you've deployed all of your land armies everywhere and they're all just sort of there in entrenched positions waiting, the enemy is just going to be like, oh, okay, here, and here. Rocks away. Oh, there goes all the land armies. Let's move in and engage. How to actually do it in the sensible fashion would be obviously to RP, spreading the forces out, writing down what forces that you have available to you. Don't bother with numbers. Don't just be like, oh, okay, the planet has 6 billion inhabitants, therefore they have 250 million troops available to them. Nobody cares about that number. You could say that, there was the first, second, and third land armies of, blah, blah, planet, whatever. That you could say. You don't have to specify what specific forces are involved, because at the end of the day, you're probably trying to tell a story. You're not trying to PvP face down, another player where you two are going to be hashing it out, making whoever's edict looks bigger. You're going to be trying to write a story. So, when conducting such RPs, irregardless of what size they are, whether you're defending an entire planet or whether it's a special forces operation or if it's an assault on an enemy space station or whatnot, choose what scale you are going to be writing at. So, for example, I had an RP with Victor, which was the Telestus RP. Great fun. We had heaps of fun in that. It was supposed to be the invasion of the planet Telestus by rogue Axiom forces, Paradox forces belonging to Bullhead. And it was supposed to be across this whole front, and whole places were getting destroyed, and there were troops and armies and whatnot. We only focused on 2 characters. And that meant that the first sort of stage of the RP was a small tank engagement between 2 tank platoons. That was it. That's what we started on. About 8 tanks total, have a good fight, small scale, they pulled back. Second bit was them actually going to a large area where there was some proper army forces, like super heavy tanks, artillery divisions, all set up for this big grand battle. And then later on it turned into a sort of special forces mission. Always choose the scale that you're going to be writing at. So for that, we're going to tell it through the eyes of 2 characters, and it's not going to change. It's going to be through the eyes of these people. That's the level that we're going for. Other RPs, like, for example, Uprising on Adelshaven, was from multiple forces' perspectives. It was from the commanders of the forces that were going to the planet. It was then from the troopers' points of view, down on the surface, and the soldiers sort of fighting in the trenches and whatnot. Then there's also something like Martyrs, which is you're overseeing the sort of ground combat across an entire planet, and again you're sort of choosing what level that you're going to be actually RPing at. And while both me and other people have had sort of character level overview, that's mostly because of dialogue. The actual roleplay has been unit scale. So rather than Division 32's tank battalion moved around to the side and their anti-tank forces moved up here, it's basically just the 31st Division has moved up to the hill and engaged. That then encompasses a shit ton of troops. But you're not writing individually what all the different forces are doing. You're fighting across an entire front. So you've sort of got tactical scale and character scale, And then you've got sort of like operational scale, where you have a large front, and you've got strategic scale, which is large groups of units fighting across different fronts. Rubicon 2 is another key example of sort of a strategic RP, because forces were done in their sort of Orbat divisions across a huge part of the Rubicon 2 planet surface, where strategic weapons were involved and all the likes. So, yeah, when RPing ground warfare in a sensible fashion, always choose what scale you're going to do it at. Make sure that your opponent also knows what scale you're going to do it at, because it's going to be a bit hard if you're, like, focusing on a character on tactical scale, and they're moving about, like, 60 divisions across an entire planet, or, like, half a planet. It's going to get a bit awkward. So always make sure what sort of level you're on. Other than that, again, no god modding, no power gaming, no metagaming. It's all standard RP. Don't number wank, don't power wank, don't focus on, all that sort of bits. But I'll ask if any of you have any sort of questions on how to RP it in a sensible fashion before we move on to how not to ground warfare RP. No questions? Okie dokie.
No questions.
Alright, so, how not to ground warfare RP? Well, as I just said, number wanking, it's not good. Nobody's gonna be reading a ground warfare RP going like, wow, blimey, I'm so glad that player X decided to write how his 125,000 men of something division have exactly this many tanks and this many artillery and this many, niche combat unit and whatever. Nobody cares about the details. Put it in the OOC chat for sure. Be like, here's my Orbat. It has roughly this amount of people in it. Sure, that's cool. But, like, going into niche details in RP is not needed. It's sort of like gear posting. It's just mind to shrivel, and it doesn't actually add anything to the RP. When writing in the sort of post, always, again, like, try to see what's going to be added to the RP, because gear posting and number posting is just not going to do that. Again, if you're fighting in a ground RP, and this also goes for space RP and any other RP, if, your opponent, if you're like on a tactical level, and your opponent rocks up with a tank, and you guys have been sort of like slugging it out, say, across this like tiny little skirmish on a river, okay? And the one side's this sort of infantry unit that's been firing AT weapons at these infantry fighting vehicles that have been coming across, and all of a sudden this tank rolls in, and the guy says like, oh, once again I bring up my ATGMs and I fire and engage, and the other person's like, oh, well, all the ATGMs do nothing to the tank, and the tank starts, say, opening fire, and then tries to argue out a character that your ATGMs can't damage his tank armour because it's this specific armour substance, and it has this specific, area defence system, and again, nobody cares. Like, just have it as a fun little thing, the tank rocks up, ATGMs fire at it, maybe it doesn't do anything. That gives the other player some adversity, but then, maybe that they do something smart and fire ATGMs at the gun or the tracks and, mission kill it or something. Just, if you're going to be writing for story, write for story. Don't just throw in things for your, like, other writing partners that are kind of going to, like, either derail or just screw the RP. Obviously, the biggest elephant in the room with any ground battle is always going to be, I use orbital bombardment. Now, if anyone ever says to you that orbital bombardment is the be-all and end-all of ground RP, ask them this question. Did the air war fully win the war in Iraq? The answer is no. It definitely contributed, but it didn't win the war in Iraq. Same as other wars. Did air power win Vietnam? No. Did air power win the various conflicts in Africa? No. Air power doesn't win wars by itself. Air power is a very, very powerful asset that you need to use in conjunction with things, but it doesn't win things on its own. Or an L, please mute.
Yeah.
So, yeah, at the end of the day, orbital bombardment is like air power. You can use it, and it is effective at what it does. However, the context is in the situation. If there is a huge, massive enemy army that is moving across open plains to try and engage your landing force, and you have ships around, yeah, blow the fuckers to hell. They're that stupid if they're just deciding to walk out in the open. If you're assaulting an enemy mountain stronghold, and you know that the enemy have, exceptionally dug-in fortifications, sure, orbitally bombard them. You probably won't wipe them out, but you might help your troops, give cover to them, or at least damage the fortifications. There's an enemy sniper a couple of doors down, and you want to orbital bombard? No. Again, like air power, there's limits to what you can do. And there's limits to orbital bombardment. Yeah, it's true. You can have super sophisticated computer systems on your ships. You can even have precision-guided munitions, yeah? You could be able to shoot a bullseye and target one house from the other side of the solar system with your fucking ship. The question is that projectile actually going to survive getting near that planet? Is it going to be shot down? Is it going to be intercepted? And then you can just think, well, I'll just put my ship in orbit. I'll just park my ship in orbit and bombard as I see fit. Okay, you can do that, but there's two sides to that probably makes you think. First off, planetary defences are so much more powerful than your ship equivalents. Your ship is constrained by its mass. Say you have 3 fusion reactors, okay? And they power a big spinal mass driver. Cool. Planet side, they have 14 fusion reactors, all powering a massive particle accelerator. Which one's going to win out? Because your battleship that's supposed to withstand your own, big kinetic mass driver is probably just going to get fucking one-shotted by the planetary charged particle beam. So, yeah.
Please mute.
Don't sort of shake off orbital defences. Orbital defences are not something you can easily wave off. Second, if you put your ships in orbit of a planet, okay, your ships are vulnerable. Starships, one of their main advantages is that they go fast. Okay? They could dodge, they can see things coming from, light hours away. They can easily change course, do interceptions, respond to threats with plenty of given time. If you put your starships in orbit over a planet, you don't have any of that anymore. You've now got to slow down because of your orbit, and because you're in orbit of the planet, you are now responding in seconds, if not less. So now you've slowed down your fleet to conduct extra precision bombardment of the planet and take out those enemy formations that you've spotted moving through those canyons. The enemy's just targeted you with their, charged particle cannon batteries that are concealed in specific positions. And all they need to do is wait for you to go around on your orbital course, get into a perfect firing position, and then they just snipe your ships out of the sky, and there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, yeah, you can randomly jink and dodge and weave, but again, if you're within orbit of a planet, and they're firing light-speed weapons, you're screwed. So at the end of the day, orbital bombardment is not the be-all and end-all. It puts your ships at risk, especially if you're doing precision engagement for enemy forces, and it's not all that effective when compared to, say, air power. You could use it sparingly, it's an asset. It's just a tool in a box. And don't get me started, if your ships go into atmosphere rather than orbit, they're dead. Like, suddenly your massive spaceships are getting shot by long-range guided artillery, cruise missiles going at lower than the fucking radar horizon, long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, all sorts. So, if you're also going to wanting to put ships in atmosphere to do bombardment, then, I mean, be my guest, but they're probably not coming back out. Anyway, yeah. So, orbital bombardment is a tool. It's also a big go-to for people who don't really know how to do ground combat, and who are dicks, just in general. Because if 3 of you come together and you say, we really want to do a ground RP, so let's make this situation where we get to have a ground RP. And you're all like, cool, cool, cool. And you come up with a plan. And you start, and suddenly the third player turns around and goes, oh, that's cool. I orbitally bombard your positions and your ground troops as they land.
Which is stupid because you'd have
Yeah.
to gain superiority in the sky first.
That's actually not the point that I was making at all. The point that I'm trying to make is that if 2 of you agree to have a good ground RP, and the third person decides to just orbitally bombard you, well, they've just gotten rid of the entire premise of the RP, and that's not fun for the other 2 players. So if somebody turns round and decides to completely and utterly shaft the rest of the players, that's not being practical. That's being a cunt. At the end of the day,
it should really build up to that.
Yeah.
It should really build up to that if you're going to orbitally bombard.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, pretty much always put the story and the enjoyment of people before any sort of like meme tactics, because at the end of the day, people who do that sort of thing, quite frankly, not a lot of people are going to want to RP with you. It's as simple as that. So, yeah, don't put emphasis on orbital bombardment, don't gear and number post, and don't sort of wank off how amazingly good your ground forces are, and, my super, mega, super duper genetically engineered super soldiers in power armor are immune to all of your soldiers' bullets or whatnot. Don't do that sort of thing. Nobody cares.
I hate that.
No.
Sorry.
Yeah. At the end of the day, like, nobody cares, and nobody wants to deal with it. So, does anyone have any sort of questions regarding...
Okay, I have a question, but this is like more to space warfare. It was just something I forgot to ask during the space warfare discussion, and you reminded me of it. Is you mentioned like ships using orbital mechanics and like orbiting around a planet, but wouldn't orbital mechanics be kind of irrelevant in Ancerious since all of the ships have ludicrous accelerations and more or less unlimited delta V?
No. I've seen plenty of... I've seen plenty of RP where orbital mechanics are coming to play. People have said that they're doing slingshot maneuvers, using planets as shields against attacks or bombardments, etc. And yeah, it's true, people do like to have infinite delta V and meme acceleration, and that is honestly something that I don't like, and I would very much like to see changed.
Yeah. All right. Well, I was just wondering because I remember seeing somewhere that people have like ships that like accelerate at like thousands of Gs.
Yes, indeed. Which is
that's going to be worked on. I mean, because I remember you saying that it was like something about like so that like space RPs didn't take like months of ships slogging through solar systems at sublight speeds.
Yes, but at the same time, it's getting a bit silly when somebody can supposedly go from like no resting full resting, no speed, going like 0.8 C in a turn.
Okay, so it's more just like something that you're still sort of looking for a solution for.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Something that's worth noting as well is, you talk about the RP justification, and you can go on being practical, but if you're killing the point of the RP, who cares? If your argument is, it's more practical to have ships in direct orbit bombarding the surface, or even come down into atmosphere and bombard, you're going to fuck up the planet anyway. Even if you're doing precision striking, the simple fact of your ships being there, if one of them detonates, you're going to spread debris and flaming wreckage and radioactivity, and you're going to have huge impacts on the surface of the planet, which is going to throw up dust clouds. If you try and do anything crazy like accelerate or use an FTL drive in atmosphere or even near a planet, you could fuck it up beyond all habitation. At which point, why don't you just destroy it from afar with a super weapon? I think people, if like you say, it's a tool in the box, but people should definitely be aware that you can't just park a ship in atmosphere or just above orbit and not have significant collateral damage to the planet below if things go sideways. You got to kind of have that in mind for your nation's motivation. Are they willing to fuck the planet up? If one of their destroyers blows up and crashes into the planet, are they willing to then occupy a planet that's in the middle of a nuclear winter?
Well, that's actually interesting that you bring that up, and that actually leads me into 3 new points that I was going to say. First off, if a ship, say you put your fleet into orbit, okay, like 150 ships, yeah, and 3 of them are big 30-kilometer battleships, okay, big hulking things. Now, you bring them close to the planet into orbit and do some bombardment of enemy positions there, yeah, because they've got some air bases and whatnot, okay. Now, your battleships are slowed down, and they can only see at light speed because of what's going on, yeah, and the distance to the planet. Those battleships then get targeted by a massive chain of those particle cannons, yeah, that we were talking about. All 3 of them get deleted. You now have, what was it, a lot of tons of debris now flying around in different directions in orbit. Congratulations, you've just Kessler syndromed your own forces. Now, if you deploy any ground forces within the next couple days, they're going to get shredded by micrometeors, by pieces of debris that your own forces have caused because they died. The second point that I was going to make is that, if you're going to do any sort of ships going near the planet itself, like directly in atmosphere, and they collapse or they get destroyed, that is a massive area that's probably going to get wiped out. And seeing as most people like to shove their ships on top of where their troops are landing, you're effectively just holding a massive nuclear warhead above your troops' heads and hoping that it doesn't just get, completely overwhelmed by 28,000 cruise missiles that are fired from forces all around the continent, that the ship cannot engage until the last possible second because the radar and line of sight horizon exist. And the third point is that, don't forget, all planets in Ancerious have usually some kind of civilian interdiction units on them, in some form or another. If you're putting your fleet into orbit around a planet, there's a good chance that that fleet is now trapped there. You've now given up the initiative. If you have a fleet that's, flying around the system, you could be mobile. If you're in orbit around a planet, you've just burnt off most of your acceleration and speed, and you're now trapped because you can't FTL away. So, yeah. As sort of the summary, yes, orbital bombardment is powerful. It is also a tool in a box, and as a tool in a box, it also comes with many advantages and many disadvantages. It's not the be-all and end-all, and there's no point in using it every single time. And it depends, Oronel. If they are wielding large numbers of super soldiers, then I guess it depends on the faction. But in the end, people's super soldiers, like, they're only as super as the player actually using them. And considering that at the end of the day, people just use them as like normal troops, their actual, like, nanosecond reaction times are probably never going to come into play ever. And yes, Kessler Syndrome can be used as low-tech equivalents of, like, planetary anti-invasion shields, and then cleared away by large laser units. Does anyone else have any sort of questions regarding how not to RP ground warfare?
Is it fair to assume that orbital bombardment is like a niche form of artillery, very specific in its use, for it to actually be useful?
Yes, it's kind of like air support. It's like if you crossed artillery and air support. Because, again, if your fleet's orbiting the planet, it might not always be in line of sight to be able to actually give you a bombardment. Depending on, obviously, the speed that they're orbiting. They could also be in geosynchronous orbit, but that's another big can of worms.
What about heliocentric orbit, if we're going to be all crazy?
Yeah. Well, if they go into geostationary orbit above their ground forces, they are now a massive target for ground forces wanting to engage them, and they've got no speed. So they have to try and get their speed up if another fleet turns up in system. But anyway, so yeah.
Fair.
Okay, so moving on to the next point. How to operate ground forces. Well, this is purely sort of depending on context, considering that everyone's ground forces are going to be very different. But always operate your ground forces in regards to how your nation's battle doctrine is. Are you a quick skirmisher? In which case you probably have lots of air mechanized infantry. You probably have no real use of huge main battle tanks or heavy units. And regard with you probably use lots of gunships and transports. Probably hover tanks, lots of ATGM vehicles, ways to hit your opponents and pretty much not get hit in return. If your doctrine is, like heavy rolling in and beating the shit out of people, then you're probably going to have a lot of heavy power armoured infantry, quite heavy infantry fighting vehicles, heavy tanks, super heavy tanks, colossi, it also depends on different factors with obviously different worlds and stuff, but it depends on doctrine. So, with operating ground forces, the things that you probably want to focus on is how big are your units? Are you one of these people who likes to spam huge amounts of units within these big armies, sort of like the Soviets during the Cold War, where their ground armies were fairly large for their size? Or do you have small, highly specialised forces which only are responsible for different situations, but they have really high quality gear? Another thing to look at is our artillery usage and support usage. This comes back to the sort of Cold War thing where I believe that Soviet armies actually had their sort of support units and their artillery down to be able to be used by lower command, sort of your initiative of lower command. So, for example, a company of soldiers is experiencing some pretty shit situations on the front line. Instead of having to send orders all the way up to, battalion or brigade command to go, please, sir, can we have the brigade artillery division hammer this position? They could turn around and they've got a company, they've got an artillery unit that's attached to their company, and all he has to do is call up this artillery unit and, have it respond. Or it could be, all of your artillery and support units are attached at the top end level, and your top end commander is who's going to be overseeing that. Also, another thing to think about is how your independent units are used. We'll sort of get onto this later on when we talk about some of the resources you can use, but so for the Orbats, you have independent units that exploit breakages in the line, or respond when your own line has been broken. You've got your frontline units that are the ones that actually engage and fight the enemy. You've got your support units that operate behind the lines to support the frontline units, and then you have independent units that are essentially, think of them as reserves, that are typically smaller than frontline units, but they have much better equipment, because those are the units that are going to be making a difference in the fight. So say your frontline units manage to batter through the enemy and force open a hole in their line. Your 3 independent tank companies are now going to rush through that line and try and exploit the break. Meanwhile, the enemy also has 2 independent tank companies, and those are then going to rush forward and try to hold the line effectively. Hello, Vic.
You're wrong.
Thank you. We're just on the topic of how to operate ground forces, and I was going through the Orbat and how frontline support and independent works, and things to think about artillery distribution, initiative of lower commanders, what your actual doctrine should be, etc.
Nice. Now, what's the conclusion?
What confusion?
That's my question. What's the conclusion?
Oh, the conclusion is that it depends on what your faction favours, as what different things that you should look into. If your faction favours fast lightning strikes, as I said, you should have lighter forces that are much more mobile, probably air mobile. They should have excellent initiative for their lower commanders, where they don't have to spend 3 hours talking to some sort of army command, trying to say, "But sir, I swear I can exploit this particular situation," and instead could just go and off and do whatever they want to ensure the whole thing's going according to plan. And also have their own attached support units that are going to be able to help them in various situations. Or you can do the complete opposite of that, which is you have these huge massive armies where they fight as a huge block. Support units are basically distributed as and where needed from really high level command, and lower commanders are pretty much just expected to follow the overall sort of extremely vague orders of the command, and then just do whatever needs doing to fight your individual battles on the ground. So, yeah. Not sure what really to add there. So, does anyone have any sort of questions about that bit, or their own factions, forces, or? Okay, I'll unmute you so you can go on, ask away.
Okay, so essentially, I was wanting to ask about various tactics of different people. So it would make sense that after a couple battles, if for say my faction went up against another faction that countered mine, it would make a lot more sense to just change tactics in a couple battles, right?
Yes, but changing tactics in battle doesn't necessarily mean changing your entire doctrine and layout of your forces.
All right.
So, for example, as an example, using the sort of Cold War analogy, the Soviets could get several large armies wiped out by NATO forces that could theoretically be smaller and more capable, but that doesn't mean that they're going to look back and go, "Oh shit, our doctrine's wrong," and they're going to try and reorganize all their forces. It just means that they're probably going to have to counter what the enemy are doing on a smaller scale.
I mean, if the Soviets actually, it was part of Soviet doctrine to get their first line armies wiped out. And I mean, like, it was literally part of the doctrine. They said that we are going to sacrifice our first, second armies, and the first, second armies don't matter; they're disposable. But the enemy, who is who has numerical inferiority, is going to reveal their positions, mowing down our first echelon army. And then our second echelon army, which is actually like the professional soldiers and the Spetsnaz and all the like the guards, tank armies and stuff, are gonna hit the enemy where they're weakest.
Hmm.
So actually, having your army destroyed can be part of your. You can trade men for information on enemy positions.
Yeah. So on a tactical level, it definitely is effective.
Operational level.
Yeah, that's the one. Any other questions? I see.
kind of have. Sorry.
Oh, go on.
Is it possible to have a like professional army that basically works on the basis of you never actually see them and they just sort of do guerrilla style like ambushes and outmaneuvering and sort of they never actually fight head on, they just hit positions and try to basically like take away the enemy's ability to carry out operations against them?
Yes, but if you do that, then at least on ground warfare, they're just gonna have to accept that the enemy is going to be able to capture any city or any objectives that they want.
Well, for the faction I'm thinking of, all of their stuff is based on a planet that they use that travels around. They only have small outposts actually permanent on planets, so they can basically afford to surrender massive amounts of things in operations.
Yeah, because like guerrilla works for like inflicting casualties and just bogging down enemies, as long as you're willing to trade something for it, like either terrain or time or something. So yeah, it works if you just like want to drag the enemy down and don't let him get this huge epic battle that he wants. Instead, you're just gonna throw him into a million fucking like tiny firefights, and he's not gonna score a decisive battle in any of them. And that's how you make like what you mentioned work. And yeah, it's possible. Like it's viable as long as you don't really like plan on making on like holding any specific terrain.
Yeah, all right, because that works. And then also to complement that, they have like a massive espionage force that's really highly trained in infiltration and information gathering, so they can know where the enemy's gonna be sending their trucks, and they can have a team come in, lay mines, and then vanish before they sort of thing, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it works perfectly fine.
Cool.
Right? Yeah, that's it.
Anyone else?
No.
Okay.
I think the key point in like using that kind of army is to never just take the bait and fight the enemy in this massive full battle. So the enemy's gonna go all like, oh, I'm gonna assemble like 30,000 fucking tank armies, and I'm gonna bring my best men into the fight. And what an irregular army, like what you're describing, is supposed to do is say, yeah, I don't care. I'm just gonna stay in my cave, and I'm gonna keep just bombing with IEDs, and I'm gonna keep hiding and ambushing you at every step of the way. I'm not gonna fight you in your terms. I'm just gonna keep just memeing on you and then running away.
All right.
And like of course, if you're like fighting against one of those armies, the goal is to set up the bait. try to make the enemy fight that kind of like epic battle.
Yeah, like force their hands. Like if they're a guerrilla style army, like how Russell explained earlier.
Yeah, more or less.
Mhm.
Alright, so next point is how to conduct ground combat with nomadic / very superior / unconventional nations. So just because you're like nomads or you're super high tech or your faction is kind of unconventional doesn't mean that you can't conduct any form of ground combat. So just because you'll say like we'll talk about the first one first, so nomads. Why would nomads have any form of sort of armed forces or army? Well, first off, if they're nomads, they're probably going to be on some sort of like giant ships, nomadic city vessels or whatnot. You're going to have some sort of force that is designed to be able to fight on your city ship, whether by defending it against some sort of like mass boarding action or being sent off to, say, asteroids or planets or whatever, if there is like a big mining effort or whatnot. Because let's face it, you're not just going to randomly evacuate your entire huge mining vessel or huge city vessel just because some dudes got aboard with shotguns. You might even have vehicles that are there to actually fight. If your nomadic places are big enough, or to support forces on the surface if they're just designed to hold an area. They may not be as developed and as sophisticated as, say, conventional ground army belonging to a regular faction, but nomads should have some form of force that allows them to engage in those types of battles to some extent. That could be like fighting guerrilla warfare, or it could be they are extremely well adapted to fighting urban or boarding actions. And, the only vehicles and support they have are, large hover drones or whatnot designed to give sort of heavy weapon fire where able. So they might be, shit against any sort of open plain warfare or whatnot. But the point is that there's still forces available to such a faction. So that if somebody says, you've got to, for this RP, the premise is going to be capturing this facility, your faction can still participate. Even though they might be at a reduced capacity, they're still going to be excelling in certain functionalities. Especially considering that if they're going to be good for, boarding or defending their city ships, they've probably got some pretty hunky armour, pretty hunky defensives, and some pretty powerful weaponry. So, for very superior factions, there's another notion that I've seen going around on several other RP servers, where if you are super powerful and super high tech, you don't need to fight ground combat. You just wave your hands and orbitally bombard the enemy into oblivion. Well, unfortunately, that's not actually the case. Again, orbital bombardment has some serious fucking disadvantages that we talked about earlier, that can put your own ships at serious risk from planetary defences. And also, the fact is that just because you're invading or attacking or trying to secure a say an Ancerium refining world, even if you're say for example the Singers or Elwar or any of the very superior factions, that infrastructure is still a basis to exploit resources. Now, it doesn't really matter if you're securing a tungsten mine because that's just material you can pick off of anywhere. But if it's, say, an actual legitimate resource, like an Ancerious resource, then yeah, you probably want to capture that intact and then be able to build off that already established infrastructure. You don't just want to go in and blow the place sky high because, well, then there's nothing to go off of and you're pretty much going to just have to put in all of the time and energy yourself. Also, let's face it, even in Ancerious, blowing planets up from orbit or glassing planets is not a good look on the diplomatic scene. If you go around just wiping out like planets and all their inhabitants, the unaligned are probably not going to want anything to do with you. And even for very superior factions, that's not good because they still rely on trade. And also the fact is that, you know, other colonial factions are probably not going to want anything to do with you, which means that your nation's going to be at a severe disadvantage in character for diplomacy reasons. You might have super duper high tech, but at the end of the day, if everyone hates you because you've been going around herder orbitally bombarding planets, yeah, that's probably going to come around and bite you in the ass. You know, just because somebody invades your planet and they're super very superior, as we've said before in the very superior faction discussion, there's plenty of ways to fight them. And guerrilla warfare is actually one of the main ways to do it, any sort of unconventional warfare. So, yeah, just because a faction is super advanced or very superior, in my opinion, doesn't mean that they should be any different from lower tech factions when, you know, trying to capture a planet or capture infrastructure or having reasons to do so, more or less. Anything else I just feel like is lazy writing. You know, I don't need to capture that planet because I already can, dare I say it, matter convert something out of thin air, in which case we immediately ban you. But, you know, shit like that. As for unconventional nations, I guess for unconventional nations we would talk about like weird hive minds and sort of what other unconventional nations are there in
I guess
Ancerios?
Wrangle. I mean, Wrangle did
Yeah.
fight an unconventional war with the Nucleans.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, again, there's plenty of reasons for ground wars and for shit like that to happen. Just because a faction is unconventional doesn't mean that it can't do the same RPs that any other faction can. I mean, look at Mai, for example. They're pretty much the template for unconventional nation, a hive mind of little girl maids that, you know, have fought against Ranksy and absolutely wiped the floor with them. So
Good time smash them.
on the ground, no less, actually fighting a legitimate ground war, or you know,
Yeah.
the Sarabs and the Ramans, who are effectively just you know, sort of like India and Pakistan equivalents with low technology, fighting against the High Imperium, or you know, the Alpha Centauri Federation, and like all that sort of stuff. It's like, well, they're still going to kick your ass, like, you know.
Also, one thing that is completely like allowed and viable and logical is that you use an unaligned as proxy.
Yep.
Like you say, oh, like you want to hurt another faction. You don't want to do it yourself, but you kind of bribe an unaligned into doing it.
Yeah.
And then you have like this completely new army at your disposal that has its own vehicles, its own army, and might have like tricks and stuff that your opponent is not. Like if your opponent is just focused on countering you, they might not be the best. They might not be like the best suited to countering an unaligned proxy or puppet.
Yep. A good example of that is the synergy that was used by the various different factions in the Second Ancerios War. Like the you know, Capital would be there with its big sort of frontline conventional forces using high amounts of nuclear artillery. You had EPA in the wing basically doing all kinds of propaganda, psycho, and ECM and electronic warfare while doing like commando ops with sort of like mind hijack civilians and shit. Then you also had Triarch, who was conducting like highly specialized raids and sort of ambushes and such. And you know, it's using different assets, but it's completely allowed, as Vic said, as to sort of hire out a private military contractor or whatever. And that's also a good way to get other players into the RP. You know, you're wanting to fight some dude, so you pay one of the players who runs a PMC to come and assist you. Boom, done. You know? So yeah. yeah, just because you're unconventional or your nation's not suited for it doesn't mean that you can't do it. Essentially, ground warfare is for everyone. And if you really want to conduct ground warfare, you will find a way to do so, regardless of what nation you are.
We talked about like the point of view of actually writing ground warfare.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, with the different yeah, we covered that in how to make it sensible, where like you can either do it from, I gave the examples of Telestus, where we told it from two characters' points of views, regardless of any other situation going on. I also talked about Martyrs, with it being from like a very strategic point of view, same as Rubicon, and then also a sort of like overall different sort of points of view with Uprising, where we had like the commanders, soldiers, army level generals, all sorts. So yeah, gone over the different types there.
Okay.
So, does anyone have any questions about the sort of nomadic, very superior, or unconventional nation side of things, or?
Not for me.
Okay. So Cora has a question. What if his armies are mostly independent forces? You can do that, I'm pretty sure.
But will there be any associated problems with that? Like, should I RPA them out, like disobeying direct orders because they see a
No.
better opportunity to do something else?
It would probably be a case of, if you're going to have lots of different independent forces, but not a lot of frontline forces, that means that while you have a lot of quite well-equipped units in reserve, your frontline forces are not going to be as numerous, which means that your army can't operate on a large front line. So say you've got like 6 different frontline units and 2 independent units. Your army can operate across a large area of like, the frontline territory and engage across a large front. But it's going to be harder at exploiting any sort of, breakout, or if the enemy break out, to actually counter such. Now, if your army consists of 2 frontline units and 6 independent units, your frontline forces can only actually engage a small area of the front line. So your army overall could potentially be outflanked a lot easier, but in that small area of front line, if there's any sort of breakthroughs, or if the enemy break through, you have quite a lot of independent units that you can then try to exploit or defend with. So, yeah, it's the payoff.
I think I get what you mean. Yeah. Thank you.
And yes, Pearl, you're also true. Blowing up planets is a lot more resources. We sort of covered that a little bit ago when I was talking about how and when to use super weapons in RP, and how you pretty much never want to use one unless every single box is ticked. Because otherwise, there's pretty much a guaranteed chance that it's going to get destroyed. So, that's right, that was last week's, I believe. That was either last week's or the week's before. Okay, so the next point is how to use orbital defences and ground assets effectively. Well, we already kind of touched on this earlier, where if the enemy fleet is in orbit above your planet, they've already burnt off most of their speed, and they're going to have less chance to dodge, especially when using, charged particle beams or, lasers or anything to that effect. So they've pretty much forfeited their 2 greatest assets as being spaceships. Ground-based sensors are extremely powerful. You're pretty much not going to be able to miss spaceships zooming around your planet. If they've gone into geostationary orbit above where they're trying to do a landing site, well, they're dead, more or less, because they can't dodge effectively, and they've pretty much given up their last remaining sort of advantage. As we said, if they're sort of zooming around the planet, it means that they're not always going to be on standby to provide orbital bombardment to their ground forces, so you can easily help them get into predetermined sort of like firing alleys. You know, you can predict where their fleet's going to be moving to, you can line up some excellent barrages. When an enemy fleet comes into sort of like firing range of a planet, you don't want to just unleash everything and yeety mcskeety. Like, you want to do it in a systemic way. So first off, you want to try and fuck with the enemy fleet. You want to try and make them believe that you are moving forces about on the surface and give them bombardment targets. So create a sort of a ghost army in the middle of desert flats that are moving out to try and maybe build a new airport, like a new airbase, by using sort of electronic interference and balloons and shit like that. You know, just how they did it in World War II before D-Day. The enemy will then think, well, okay, there's targets to bombard. They'll bombard those targets, and then you can then immediately see what their sort of plan is. They'll come in to try and land ground forces. When they're most vulnerable, you then hit them with not all of your defences. You don't want to do that. You don't want to give everything away. Only the defences that can engage them and might do the most damage initially. Then you can use stuff like mobile launchers to try and disperse any sort of return fire. You can use aerospace forces to fire surface-to-orbit weapons, but you can do so outside of their ability to hit you. So you can fire surface-to-orbit missiles on the other side of the planet that can then go into orbital paths that the enemy ships can't hit until, you know, the last possible second. While then using direct fire weapons like, you know, mass drivers or lasers or charged particle beams to engage them in the area that they're actually dropping. Do you have anything to sort of add, Vic, while we're talking about this?
No.
Awesome. But yeah, pretty much you wanna maximize the damage that you can do with your orbital defenses, even if it's just chip damage. You know, if the enemy have lost a cruiser or say a destroyer to like some random missile silo on the surface, then like score one, because like that's an actual legitimate mobile asset that the enemy have that's just been completely annihilated by a disposable asset that you have. A good example of disposable assets, the Union of Worlds uses the Kraken fields that they have that are pretty much just rows and fields of one-shot missile tubes that are submerged at the bottom of the ocean and kept to tethers. And they just sit silently, and then when the enemy force gets close and goes into orbit, they all the cables sever, the pods go up to the surface, and then the missiles just come out and fire. The enemy can't fire back because it's a one-shot system, so all they're firing at is some random floating tubes in the ocean, but they now have to contend with several hundred missiles. One-shot defences are, of course, pretty effective, but again, they're one-shot, so you want to use them in conjunction with other defences, but also then realise that the moment your static defences open fire, even if they're concealed, the enemy now know where your static defences are. So you want to only reveal them and use them sparingly. But mobile transports, air units that can carry big weaponry, and one-shot orbital defences, you want to use in concert. And just continually do as much chip damage as you can. Especially targeting enemy forces that are obviously dropping. If you want to prioritise sort of units that are dropping onto the planet rather than actually targeting enemy ships, yeah, do so. It's perfectly effective. Just realise that most of your obvious assets, like air bases, missile silos, big fortifications, are pretty much going to be like targeted the moment the enemy fleet comes into range, and easily bombarded, even if they are pretty strong. Any sort of other questions about that, or? I think we also covered using ground-based defences and orbital defences in a couple of weeks ago, actually, as well.
What about denying the enemy the planet or the objective when or if your ground forces lose the fight?
Okay, so this kind of ties into something a bit different, like a different topic, but that entirely depends upon the context. If you have a ground force, okay, this is a hypothetical scenario. So the enemy have just invaded your planet, okay, and it's a well-industrial world, and you have ground forces that are defending it, and they receive orders to destroy all of the factories and industry, okay, because the enemy have defeated your ground forces, and they now have orders to scorched earth and destroy everything. What do you think your populace are going to think when you start blowing up all of their work, their livelihoods, their source of income? They're not going to be happy. And if those soldiers are also ones who are on the planet, they're probably not going to want to destroy their own livelihoods. They're probably just going to surrender. Obviously, it depends on the enemy, but at the end of the day, this comes into the topic of jihading, where people seem to think that, oh, because I'm going to lose, I'm just going to throw away everything that was here. Like, I'm just going to suicide all my forces into the enemy to take them with me. I'm going to blow up all my assets. I'm going to destroy everything that I have. You don't do that.
You do it and then you write the consequences.
Yeah, or like it's pretty much a thing of you don't like factions and forces don't tend to do that because self-preservation is a thing. However, if you do write that, there's going to be consequences. If you send a load of your troops to suicide into the enemy to do as much damage to them as possible, while scorched earthing your own planet, destroying all of its industry and infrastructure, the rest of your population are gonna want to know why, because that means that if the enemy comes to their planet and say their critically underfunded or undefended area is now getting taken over by, which is likely to get taken over by the enemy, that means that there's probably going to be orders coming down that all of your livelihoods and your industry and more is probably going to be sabotaged and destroyed as well. And you're not going to be happy about that.
Real life examples of when side's been losing and they just send their armies on suicide runs are like fucking Russia and Germany in World War One, and both of them ended in revolutions.
Yeah, or Japan in World War Two.
When you know that it's a suicidal mission that you're going on for, like, all right, your fleet's going out against impossible numbers, and you're like underpaid and you're starving and stuff. You know what? Why don't I just surrender?
It's like Hitler's Nero decree in that he gave a decree that everything in Germany was supposed to be leveled, but instead half the Wehrmacht just straight up they just like half-heartedly kind of set some little house or something on fire, and then they'd surrender.
Yeah, obviously the difference is that if you're fighting like a devouring swarm or like an enemy that doesn't have any sort of concept of surrender or whatnot, and is just going to genocide you or butcher you anyway, then like, okay, fair enough, yeah, you can just deny it everything and detonate nukes in every city or whatnot. But yeah, at the end of the day, against a reasonable like foe, scorched earth is viable, but you absolutely have to RP the results of that, because your population's probably not going to be happy.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. With like an enemy that's like it's all or nothing, That's kind of what I was thinking.
I mean, truth be told, if it's all or nothing, the enemy might not even be invading you with ground troops anyway. If they're trying to genocide you as a whole, there's much more effective ways to do so than ground invasions.
That is true, but I meant like if they're genociding you for resources or something. You know what I'm saying?
I'd certainly hope they're not genociding someone for resources.
Yeah.
Because the last thing we want is somebody to randomly start genociding somebody else over like, oh, you have more iron than I do. And then I start banning people.
But what if they're genocide for Ancerium?
There's plenty of areas that you could get Ancerium without having to genocide anyone.
I mean,
That's
research,
kinda...
but I don't think like any country in real life over resource wars have decided let's kill the entire workforce that have built their lives around extracting these resources.
Let's ask
Nazi,
Turkey.
Nazi Germany says hi.
Very counterintuitive.
Fair.
What about Germany?
I was saying that about how the Third Reich invaded Poland, like places like Poland and that, and then they basically just started genociding all the Slavs that lived there.
I mean, they genocided them because they were Slav, not because they had resources. Because
Yeah.
they also
Yeah.
took over like Alsace and Lorraine in France, and they just forced the people to work, but they didn't just like fucking burn down the cities and throw them into gas chambers.
And they still fell in the end because they had to deal with all of the repercussions of those things. So, like, the point still stands. Okay, any other questions about how to use orbital assets or whatnot?
Is it generally a better strategy or like better policy to do like a focus landing on a planet, like focus on one specific place to do your landing, or is it just generally better to do like a whole spread across the entire planet?
I would say whole spread, because the last thing you want to do is drop somewhere in one place, and the next thing you know, as a radar operator, there's 18,000 contacts coming at you, and every single one is a nuclear cruise missile. And you have to shoot down every single one of them, because if those 150 megaton warheads gets through, your entire landing site goes up in flames. So yeah, personally, I believe that you should probably drop in a quite a wide area. But if you're only trying to take one specific location, and that location is important, then you'd probably be able to get away with it somewhat, dropping in one place. Because obviously the enemy isn't going to want to drop 18,000 50 megaton warheads on top of their, Ancerium refinery or whatnot. So yeah. Besides Extremophiles, are there any other active or archived RPs involving high-speed / air-ground combat? I think so.
The Lawless side had massive air-to-ground action.
Yeah. Also, Rubicon 2 had some pretty big air fighting, if I remember correctly, in the actual combat drop. So yeah, it exists. Lastly, what resources will be helpful to doing these RPs? So, obviously, the first one is going to be wherever the fuck this thing's gone. Dan's Orbat template, which quite a few people have worked on. This is a great resource to use when designing your ground forces. Able to pretty much put you get all of your basic unit icons, and you can modify them in whatever unique way that your faction uses. And it gives you a standard layout for an example Soviet mechanized army, and shows you the layout of your HQ, and then what we talked about earlier, your frontline units, your support units, your independent units, and your extra support units. It also has details on there for fleets, if you wish to do Orbats for fleets. So that's a fantastic resource to use. I swear I had something else that was also very helpful for ground warfare, but I can't remember. Actually, on the topic of Orbats and stuff, where'd it go? For example, Orbats, just in case you want to get a feel of like what different nations have used over the course of IRL. That site, which is also pinned in historical messages and historical bits, is pretty much a website that has Orbats from like a lot of different time periods, with loads of different factions and like nations in the world. So that's really useful as well. What other interesting things have we got?
Tech.
Tech?
Tech.
In what way?
TIK.
YouTube channel.
Oh!
Yeah, I think that he's like a cool resource from an OOC perspective, because he's made this like huge series about the Battle of Stalingrad. He explains it in detail. And the thing about the Battle of Stalingrad is that it involves like fucking 40 divisions per side. And he manages to narrate the battle from the perspective of the divisions. Pretty cool. So like he's actually a good resource on how to write, like how to make it exciting when you're just talking about like these huge formations and these generals decided to make moves, and like how you don't necessarily have to talk about soldiers in the foxholes to actually make it exciting and make it dynamic. And while like obviously you're not supposed to write the Battle of Stalingrad, but he gives a good idea of how you write this in an actual like approachable manner that doesn't just sound like a list of actions.
Another good resource would be a YouTube channel called Covert Cabal. We've linked quite a few of his stuff as well, but he goes into details on like electronic warfare, how air warfare occurs, and more of the sort of like unconventional side. So stuff like anti-ballistic missile systems, how you use cruise missiles, as I said, electronic warfare, strategic warfare, the things that you don't normally see every day. But he also goes into stuff like that as well, and he's pretty down to earth, and his explanations are pretty like, he doesn't go into like, oh, here's this hard math, but like he's like, hey, here's an example of a modern day system that will do this job, and it could be used in this regard, and it's pretty like down to earth. So that's another really good resource to use. Just thinking of anything else that we have that is a good resource. Or any other YouTube channel that I can think of. What's this? This looks interesting.
What is?
Yeah, there we go. Here's another Orbat place. Another site that's extremely good for Orbats, which is Battle Order. Recommend checking that out as well, in case you need more going over of how to have warbats and such. We also have in pinned messages and inspiration and reference the American and Soviet operational manuals, which are linked. Man, we've got so much random shit in inspiration and reference. We also have an inspiration and reference a full-on PDF of 296 pages of Special Forces Unconventional Warfare Operations, just in case you're feeling particularly adventurous. So yeah, usually if you want any other resources as well, Ancerious, you can just ask an inspo and reference, and somebody will probably find something for you. Or if you're not sure on what to do or what to use, go to GenDev. Everyone's usually pretty fucking hyped when they get to talk about ground warfare stuff. Purely because space comes up too much. But apart from that, I think that's everything for that as well. So, I guess now it's just any questions regarding any of these topics or just in general. Feel free to unmute and ask if you wish.
Just trying to find all the things you mentioned in Depends. It's a long list.
It is. There's a lot in inspiration and reference.
I've heard a bug crib about something. Yeah.
No questions at all, or
Okay, so kind of with Orbat and the general conversation, would just be a bad idea to have MPs as a tertiary line. Like you've taken a place and you put like a division of MPs with all their accoutrements there, and then they somehow get hit by the enemy or something.
yeah, you don't want military police on the front line, usually.
Yeah, but like, would the division existing be a bad idea?
Military police are not organised in divisions, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I have no idea, man. I just know that they do exist.
Yeah, this isn't like Hearts of Iron when like you create a new division template and you just fill it with military police to like quell subversive activities. Like military police are normally operate in a different fashion to conventional army forces.
Well, also to my understanding that they also do operate in places with low stability like Iraq and Iran, at least until the Americans pulled out.
True, but typically military police are not actually there to stop what you would call like subversive activities. Military police are actually there to investigate and like basically be the police force of the armed forces to make sure that the actual troops are behaving.
Gotcha. So that's more like a barracks or FOB kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or just barracks.
What you would want to use for anti-insurgency sort of stuff is counterinsurgency special ops. So special forces can be used in counterinsurgency roles.
Yeah.
But yeah, Victor can go more into that if he wants to. But
what? I didn't quite get the question.
like the military police are very different to like counterinsurgency.
I will say that I do not know much about what the actual role of military police is. I had full disclosures. I'm retarded.
Okay,
I think like when the army's engaged in combat, military police also serve as like base security in that.
yeah. I would actually recommend that if we're unsure about military police, ask Nazaroth, because apparently he's an ex-military policeman for 5 years, so... If anyone knows anything about military police, it's probably the ex-military policeman.
Nonsense,
Azeroth.
he's left.
One of the big roles is to prevent the presence of military, especially on like fucking leave or something, or like waltzing through the town they're garrisoned in or whatever, causing a bunch of trouble.
Yeah.
Like in Australia, they had to fight. The American military police had to fight the rest of their army because they were getting rowdy with the Australians.
Yeah. That was a fun one from Mark Felton. Oh, that's another one as well. Mark Felton, but that's less for actual like tactical stuff and more because he does cool things.
I don't know what you're talking about military police not affecting rebellion. In Hearts of Iron 4, if you add military police, it
Shut the fuck
increases
up, Luke.
suppression.
Well, I was more like going with Iraq and Iran. For after the invasion, there's terrorists showing up and military police dealt with them, as far as I know. That's what the documentaries say.
To some extent. Anyway, yeah, ask Nazaroth. He's who I advise talking to on that.
Gotcha.
Any other questions? I see.
Yeah, I got nothing right now.
I'm really sleepy.
I see. Well, thank you for coming to the TED Talk. I will.
Thank you.
I rate it 1 out of 5.
Good.
Thank you, Mr. Marek.
No problem.
Mwah.